Sally Chan is a senior teaching fellow in the business school at the University of Leeds. Hi, Sally, how are you doing?
Great, thank you. Thanks, Paul, for the invite. This is
And
exciting.
you are principally working in the area of advertising and representation, but you are very much invested in issues around martial arts in adverts at the very least and in film. And you've just published an article on the use of Chinese and Asian martial arts in British advertising, right?
That's right. It's called High Karate and Kung Fu. And I deliberately chose those titles to make sure that everybody gets to read it. So it's not just for the academic profession, but it's accessible to all. So yeah.
So let's give everyone a brief introduction to the relationship between martial arts or Asian martial arts and British, or any country advertising that you know about, that you because this focuses specifically on British advertising, right? Tell us a little bit
It
about the history.
is.
What's the first things that we see with martial arts and adverts?
The first thing that we'll see in martial arts in adverts in Britain, because my specialty focuses on British advertising, focusing originally on British TV, the first thing that you see is probably black and white print adverts, which is reflective of the sort of 19 sort of 50s and 60s, where print advertising was the main form of communication in Britain at the time. So it's probably a lot of black and white stuff that you see first of all, and then later on you probably get a lot more sort of colourful, creative advertising seeping in to the lexicon. So it's sort of quite easy to analyse, I suppose, and easy for us to digest, because they're showing advertising from quite a simple perspective in terms of the visuals. So you have the sort of black and white imageries, which are quite simply laid out with usually quite heavy text or copy in those adverts. And then later on, as we had more of the sort of visual technology available to us in terms of media, you're starting to see a lot more of these sort of moving images. So you've got your TV linked into your sort of cinema adverts. Very reflective of what you see in cinemas later on. So yeah, so you could see sort of, you can track how things have moved in terms of the media's influence on advertising.
So what are the first kind of products that are advertised using Japanese or Chinese imagery?
Most of them tend to focus on, if it's to do with martial arts, they tend to focus more on sort of aftershave, because it's about sort of ensuring that you get a lot of budget to devise those adverts. So it tends to be large brands that are able to go for those sorts of forms of media, because advertising is one of the most expensive forms of media that you could use in the old days, that is. So it tends to be bigger brands, or brands that are interested in looking at ensuring that they have a bit more of a mass exposure. And gaining awareness would be one of the key things. So be sort of, your High Karate was one of the 1970s adverts, and that's quite it's sort of like a funny take on your sort of visual representation of how you could get that message across of the benefits of wearing your aftershave, and you get all these sort of like very attractive one single woman who will sort of run after you as a result of that. So it tends to be based on those sort of product categories related to that. They tend to be fast moving consumer goods, so things that fly off the shelves quite quickly. So it'll be things like crisps or snacks, confectionery. And in the old days, I found an earlier one on carpets, which is a really interesting one. It's BMK Carpets, which is a Scottish manufacturer. And they had a couple of really interesting take on martial arts, using a very attractive lady, the actress of whom has become a bit of has a bit of a following. So it's Edwina Carroll, who has since gone on to sort of TV and film after being featured in these series of adverts. And she's known as the BMK girl, not the BMX girl, but the BMK girl. And she's, I think a lot of men of a certain age will remember her. In particular. So yeah, it's
a lot of men. So I think so you've got your title, you've got high karate and kung fu. So the high karate adverts. Now it's interesting because I think the first one was about 1967, and they were massive through the 70s, and they made British versions, I think, first, and then there was follow-up American versions. Now the British comedy of the high karate advert is based on some very average bloke puts on the high karate. There's instructions in the packet about how to do self-defense, and he might be in a hospital or a supermarket or some situation, and one beautiful woman finds him irresistible and chases him around, and he's trying to defend himself against it. But the American version is different. In the American version, I don't know if you've seen them, but it's normally like a guy comes home from work and his wife finds him irresistible, and it's the same structure, but it's like a different, it's much less kind of British, kind of like Carry On film sort of innuendo kind of stuff. Did you look at any of the American ones, or is it mainly?
I did look at the American website. I think George Newell, I think he started the adverts. It was his idea to come up with the brand. So he's put a lot of his original American adverts on his website, and they are quite interesting, because I think they were from sort of the 1950s thereabouts, and or sort of 1960s, and it is very much about the housewife scenario. In terms of how the sort of target owners will sort of find affiliation with. But it's only from the 1970s on that you're starting to get a bit more of a slightly different message of the empowered female, and the sort of 90s. So you've got the 1960s sort of women empowerment coming into play there. So I think the messages have had to be adapted over time from the housewife, who would be sort of becoming over amorous, to the sort of women just out there. I think in one of the British ones, you also have some of the ladies in like a sort of like a dance clubs, like a strip club type thing scenario as well. So it's so reflective of the sort of era, which is what advertising should try to do. So I think in America, I think we need to look at the context of when the adverts were made. So talking about the 1950s and 60s, so you've got Housewife, and then as you move over to the 60s, it's sort of like, sort of free power, or whatever, and then it sort of moves to the 1970s, a bit more of sort of equal play, if you like, and a bit more comedy coming into it. But it is true what you say, Paul, because the British do have an affiliation with comedy in advertising, and those sorts of adverts tends to work really well. It's just the particular take, and with the influence of films that were popular at the time. So you're talking about the Carry On films, and you talk about lots of comedies in the 1970s. That was showing on mainstream British TV, things like Mind Your Language, which shows various different races and things, but it's all comedic as well, to get that sort of cut through to your audience. And it's a particular type of humour that works really well, I think, with the British market.
So one of the more controversial ones, I can't remember if it was you who introduced me to this. It was an advert for Walker's Crisps, and it featured a Chinese guy who's just obviously come over from Hong Kong or from China, and he's visiting his brother, and he wants some Walker's Crisps. Do you know the advert? You remember it?
Oh, yes, I know that one,
and,
yes.
And the guy at the stall, the Cockney geezer, won't sell him the Walker's Crisps and tries to sell him some other crisps. And he goes kind of nuts, and he does the classic Bruce Lee thing of he destroys the place. And that was sort of banned because it was regarded as trading in stereotypes and could possibly cause offense. I mean, I think that it's trying to be funny. It's not trying to be racist. It's trying to refer back to Bruce Lee, Fist of Fury, smashing the kind of, no Chinese and dogs allowed sign. I
Yeah.
mean, what do you think about the representational implications of
That
adverts?
one I remember seeing, and I remember my gut reaction when I first saw it was, "Whoa, that's a bit offensive."
Okay.
That was me. That's coming from I wasn't even studying advertising at the time. I just saw it on TV. I thought, oh no, not again. Oh no. So it had quite negative connotations for me, purely because I have links to the catering trade. And, my father came over in the 1950s. We set up in catering. And so we were aware that there was a lack of representation of Chinese people on TV when we were
Mm-hmm.
growing up in the 1970s and 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And then I see this Chinese guy sort of doing what I thought was quite stereotypical representation in terms of what he did. He got annoyed with what was being said, and then he does this martial arts thing.
Yeah.
At the time, I wasn't doing martial arts, so I wasn't that enamored with martial arts as a thing.
Yeah.
So I just saw a Chinese guy being sort of overreacting
Yeah.
on screen. I thought, oh no. And it was his accents that really sort of
Yeah, it's like a pigeon
stood
English,
out.
isn't it? It's
Yeah,
like
because he had
present
pidgin
tense
English
and
and things
yeah.
like that. And
Yeah.
which I thought, oh, here we go, another Chinese person on TV,
Mm-hmm.
one of a few, and he had an accent. I thought, oh no, that's
Mm-hmm.
really gonna make
Yeah.
things quite bad for me if I go out there. People are going to
Okay.
assume that this is what I'm going to sound like. I mean, I've got a bit of a Chinese accent, but um, and I thought, oh, could have done a bit of a better representation. I don't think at the time agencies would have spoken to members of the population about it.
Yeah.
Even if they did, there would be a lack of understanding of representation, what it means for certain ethnic groups that are being
Yeah.
depicted. So I think it's reflective of its era.
Mm-hmm.
People remember it because it's funny,
Mm-hmm.
and it's good for the brand because it raised awareness. But maybe for certain sections of the population, I had negative
Mm-hmm.
connotations. I don't
So,
think people were able to voice those opinions at the time. So
do you,
it's good that we do these reflective studies.
oh yeah, definitely. Do you know much about the advertising career of Burt Kwok? I mean,
Bert Clock,
because
yes.
he was like the go-to actor to depict anything Chinese or Japanese or Asian on British television. It seems like for decades. I mean, he did so many adverts. Some of them are deeply problematic in terms of
Mhm.
representation. Some are just funny. But I mean, what
Yeah.
do you make of his contribution to these
I quite like
representations?
Bert because he's a national treasure, isn't he? So I quite like the stuff that he did, particularly with the I can't remember the name of the brand, but there'd be him stood in a scene, the TV advert, and then the car would drop down, and then it would be saying something in like a Japanesey sort
Mhm,
of accent.
mhm.
I thought they were quite funny. I quite like Bert
But
because I
but he
I
did a
thought,
lot of so like like pigeon English. He did a lot of
yes,
stuff that nowadays you'd go, oh, like
oh yeah,
no one.
definitely, yes. Yeah. The asshole thing was quite problematic. I think for a lot of the children who were growing up in playgrounds in the 1970s, it was said everywhere,
Yeah,
and it's quite a racist
yeah,
noise that you hear all around you. So it was quite problematic in that respect that it popularized
mhm,
that you could it's on TV, you could say it, so it made people say it more and more. I think I
mhm,
felt um and but I think it's quite difficult. I think with one of the adverts that is featured in the paper,
mhm,
that high karate and kung fu paper,
mhm.
it does give an example of how arsehole became popularized as
Yeah,
a result of this very revered advert by a very well-known agency, Collett Dickinson Peers, at the time, who were known as like the best agency that you could work for.
yeah,
And for Wall Sausages, what they did was they really made use of the saw,
yeah,
this guy sort of stabbing his fork onto the sausages there.
mhm,
Um, it was heard all in all the homes
yeah,
up and down. It just really made it okay to use such a phrase.
mhm,
I didn't realize this was happening at the time. All I heard was, asshole being sort of said in the playground. Um, But now that I've gone back and looked at it, I thought, well, actually, I can see where all that came from.
Mm.
And it's the advertisers.
It's
They
it's
need to take a bit of
yeah.
a, because TV commercials are quite sort of, 30 seconds,
Hmm.
15 seconds, 30 seconds, clips that are like, designed to grab your attention, and it's meant to, it sort of normalizes certain
Yeah.
behavior,
Yeah.
which I guess is what happens with films and
Yeah.
TV, and with Bert, in terms of what he did. I can see two sides to the argument, because I quite respect that he had to. I mean, he was very successful in terms of the public's awareness of who
Mm.
he is, and he's been, had quite a successful career for quite a long time.
Mm.
And also his seminal role in Pink Panther, as
Yeah.
the famous Kato
Yeah.
sidekick. I think that's quite a positive thing.
Hmm.
But in terms of the impact of that on what happened to the community and
Yeah.
the sort of racial name calling and all that,
Hmm.
that's not a good thing.
Hmm.
I think you need to have one or the other to get to where we are now, to be able
Yeah.
to sort of
I
discuss it.
mean, in terms of where we are now, because I mean, so just this is like full disclosure to anyone who doesn't know this. So Sally wrote an article for an issue of a journal called Jomek Journal, and I also wrote an article. So our articles are side by side, and my article was called something like chop socky to chop suey, or chop suey to chop socky, and it's about the same advertising history. And I look at the representation of Chineseness in British television advertising. So if anyone wants to check out the articles, they're available, open access, free, online, Joe Mac Journal, Cardiff University Press. And I mean, so you're very interested in the sense that adverts have an effect. I mean, they have an effect on what people believe. So the whole kind of stereotypical so situation. And I wonder how far it's moved on, because now if we think about Chinese representations of China and Chinese martial arts in advertising, the biggest thing that leaps to mind is the Rowan Atkinson Snickers advert. I mean, is that one of the most recent big
It
budget,
is, yes.
long running, and in that kind of appeals to a crouching tiger, hidden dragon, wuxia type of aesthetic. I mean, do you think that's better or worse, or is it progressive representation of Chinese culture in some way or not?
I mean, it's good to see different forms of martial arts being represented in the advertising. In this case, I think the ethnicity has been taken out of it in terms of the main character being just sort of being there.
Mm.
So it's I think it's a good thing, because it makes people. It's more about the martial arts,
Mm.
and it doesn't feature any sort of negativity. There's a bit of humor in there, obviously, but
Mm.
doesn't have too much of a negative connotation. There's no sounds or anything like that for starters, so not that I'm aware of.
Mm.
So it seems to be great for martial arts, and it's great for the film industry, and it's great for the wushu sort of stylistic aspects of martial arts. It doesn't feature the main character isn't Chinese. It doesn't bother, doesn't offend anybody. So I think it's sort of managed to sort of feature martial arts quite authentic in its representation, with the sort of clever camera angle, and just
Mm.
sort of you got your acrobatic
Mm.
and some demonstration of skills and techniques there,
Mm.
all sort of done in that sort of sort of
Yeah,
give
yeah,
you the indication that real martial arts is actually occurring
yeah.
through the way it's filmed. And then you get your sort of Mr. Bean character. I
Mm.
think that works quite well. I don't think it offends anybody, and I think it's a good halfway house of how you
Mm.
might do martial arts.
Mhm.
But in
So,
terms of how authentic it actually is, because I mentioned camera angles and stuff,
yeah,
it's sort of they have Chinese looking actors,
yeah.
but not sure if they're proper martial artists. If you contrast that to
Like,
the Kung Fu advert from
yeah.
1970s, You've got this proper sensei who came over from the 19th, who was invited over by the British government to encourage people to take up martial arts. He was one of the innovators who came over, and he got, I think, some demonstration on BBC TV,
Yeah.
and the media got sort of interested in him, and he started fronting quite a few campaigns. But he's a proper sensei, from years of training. He's a proper master, and he's properly demonstrating his, sort of board breaking skills in the adverts. So that's got some authenticity in terms of the martial art, and it's got that realness, because he's probably just doing it like proper board breaking, not sort of made it. Obviously, they might make it look extra effective.
So there, in terms of your argument, at least in that article, you want to, you kind of make a call for adverts to be more to have more ethical responsibility in terms of the consequences, because they do, like you say, with the ASO and with the stereotypes that are circulated. I mean, these are adverts are quite intense little messages that are repeated regularly and that have themes and that have little hooks that get people repeating them in different ways, either thinking or saying or wanting to buy the product or raising awareness of the product and so on. But at the same time, I guess they also strongly tying representations of Chinese, Japanese, and Asian identities. They're tying them strongly to stereotypes of martial arts. I mean, martial arts are a strong stereotype, but you still see a value in that connection. I mean, is that connection in itself not somehow on some level offensive because it's so Orientalist and so stereotypical? Or do you not think? I mean, I think martial arts are great, obviously. So the more I see them, the happier I am. But then again, it's not my ethnic identity that's being simplified and reduced to I must therefore be a kung fu master or a jiu-jitsu expert or something. I mean, how do you negotiate that complexity?
This might be slightly beyond my area, but I guess there's quite a lot in film studies and so on, which looks like authenticity in martial arts films, where you've got, there's the debate that you've got to have, it's got to, if it's kung fu, it's got to be like it's proper Chinese sifu who does the kung fu. And then there's the other argument that no, it doesn't. That's a racialist argument, So there's some debate about that going on. I think that probably warrants a bit more research. My idea actually came from my own experience. So when I was growing up, and I wanted to take up martial arts, age 13, 14, whatever, it was really weird because I thought, well, if I want to do martial arts, I've got to find like a Chinese sifu, ideally, that's top of my list, or it's got to be like a Japanese sensei. And that's how I thought. As I was, sort of, obviously, sort of immigrants, sort of Chinese sort of upbringing. My father was very authoritarian. I don't think he would have let me do martial arts if it was not taught by an ethnic or an Oriental person. So I think that sort of clouded my sort of judgment. So that's from my personal experience of looking at martial arts. But then as I got older and I started looking at clubs and things and stuff, I felt, well, actually, it doesn't matter what nationality and ethnicity the person is, as long as they're good at what they're doing. So it was like, so I learned my lesson that, although I experienced racism and discrimination when I was growing up, I was actually just using that to discriminate others. So I learned my lesson since then. But I've also heard as well other people say, oh, if you do Tai Chi and you learn it from a proper master. Proper in inverted commas, like an ethnic, a Chinese bird, then there's that sort of, I've sort of noticed that there's some unsaid feeling going on, that it's got that authenticity element to it, which I'm rediscovering, going, oh, is that right? It's got to, go for that sort of element. So I'm still finding my feet in terms of whether that is true or not. But I've also had people say to me, oh, you're doing martial arts, or, is your sensei like Japanese? And people are like curious to know. They're looking at the door. Is it a Japanese person that
Yeah.
does it? So so people who don't do martial art have actually asked me that
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not in the first meeting, but eventually. Does
Yeah.
that make me think that there is still that sort of thing going on? But I haven't looked into it in too much detail. But these are my
Mm.
personal experiences of
Okay.
it. So I've much to learn. I think my I'm doing karate at the moment with my
Okay.
sensei. He's a British guy.
Yeah.
He's a fantastic instructor. I've also learnt taekwondo from a really well-respected British Asian guy, so it's like total respect to them.
Yeah.
So I hope I haven't offended anybody with my,
Well,
my
I mean,
views.
I guess it raises the question, because if we tie it back to adverts, um, and we think about the globalization and the fact that we can disconnect cultural practice, or supposedly cultural practices, from ethnicities, right? We don't have to. You don't have to be Chinese to be a Tai Chi master, I guess. Um, and yet we still see, like, I've seen you present work, and you've looked at the way that the images of Bruce Lee have been kind of retooled and remediated and reused and reiterated in different ways across time. And that's a big, like, Bruce Lee's a big structuring theme, right? It's like he's one of the, he's a trope. It's which way are we going to talk about martial arts? We've got a handful. Bruce Lee is one of them. I mean, will it always be like that? Is Bruce Lee always going to reappear and recur and restructure adverts that want to quickly evoke martial artsiness? Maybe something about Hong Kong, maybe something about this, I don't know, the 70s, because there's some fabulous adverts that use these images
It
in
is,
different.
yeah, some really great
Um,
ones.
what do you think?
I think in the West, definitely there's a massive appetite for Bruce Lee. With the sort of way the adverts are going, there's a lot of retro, and with the sort of lockdown situation, people are looking back into the sort of history, what we did before, and what life was like in the old days. So there'll be a lot more reflective and more use of sort of 1970s and 80s coming back and seeping into the adverts. And I think Bruce Lee, because he's such a cool guy, and he's popularized in the media so much that it would be rude not to use his representation in any shape or form if you were going to do martial arts. So I reckon for advertisers who are thinking, oh, we're going to do a martial arts theme, ping, immediately it'll be Bruce Lee. And I think, right, how can we use him? What can we use him for, and what sort of representation do we want to have? There was a really great advert in the 1990s for Levi's jeans. That was
Yeah,
probably the
I was
best
thinking of that one.
representation of.
I was thinking of that one. Yeah,
That was probably the best representation when I saw that on TV.
yeah,
So this is a Vietnamese American guy, Dustin Nguyen, who was recruited and was featured in Jonathan Glazer's advert, and he's become one of the most successful uh, creative directors ever in the field of advertising. And it's really, really a great take, because on the one hand, it's got all the stereotypical stuff that you can find in terms of Chinese representations. You've got the laundry,
yeah,
you've got the the triad gangs,
yeah,
and you've got the subservient female
yeah.
in there who doesn't speak a word, and then you've got all these sort of sounds that you find in typical martial arts films. So that could be like quite a negative stereotype, but people don't really notice that. They just notice this really great sort of
But
Bruce
it's
Lee
it's
character.
also it's also quite progressive in the sense that that Levi's advert was about 1997 or something like that, and this is the time when film critics and film studies people are saying the the film industry was steadfastly refusing to kind of eroticize the Asian male character. So, like, yeah, Asian women can be
Mhm.
eroticized in Western film and television culture, no problem. But that advert shows him as, like, cool and sexy. Like, it emphasizes his masculinity and how sexy he is, right, in a way that wasn't really
Does.
happening in film or television in the West.
Oh, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. But it's really interesting that Bruce Lee would have his torso on show, but probably due to the advertising standards, they had to make him wear a white vest. I
Mm.
don't know if that's sort of because it's sort of slightly covered up, but he's obviously ripped as well, you know. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, I think, yeah, that's quite an interesting take. I haven't thought about that. Um, so I think, yeah, some interesting lessons could be learnt from that particular advert. I think that sort of made a sea change in terms of how you could use Bruce Lee in advertising, and the fact that it could have potential benefits if you use that form of representation, despite all the negative associations, or that I might have had with the what it actually represents. Um, yeah, I think at the time, as well in the 1990s, there was a lot of stuff about Bruce Lee absolutely everywhere. Because I remember going to clubs and things, you would see like little flyers that you just put a picture of Bruce Lee on there, and it's become like the coolest flyer that you can get anywhere. So he was
Yeah.
he's been recycled, hasn't he, quite a
Yeah.
bit, and it was quite intense in the 1990s. I remember seeing quite a lot of people having like Bruce Lee characters on their sort of t-shirts and things.
Mhm.
I thought, oh wow, that's really cool. It's really great, and wow, people are starting to recognize that you could actually put a Chinese character on your item of clothing, and it looks super cool. So that was quite good for me to see.
Yeah.
And it was absolutely everywhere, wasn't
Well,
it? In
in the
clothing
90s,
and sort of
there were even, I mean, even big high street shops in Britain like Next. You could buy. They'd had a range. I had a one that said, it said on the back it said Lee China, and on the front was Bruce. I mean Lee China, right? It should be more
wow.
Lee California. But yeah, and that was Next. I mean, that's really as mainstream and kind of bland a high
It
street shop
is.
as you can think of. And that, so in the 90s, Bruce Lee was front and center in
Yeah.
a lot of contexts. But in terms of your work, what so you've published the article on martial arts in British advertising. Is there anything else martial artsy that's coming our way from you, or is your work
Well,
elsewhere?
it's really quite interesting what you say. Since the papers come out, I've had quite a few debates with people about the work, and it's quite interesting that the sorry to sound so, but the female perspective is coming into it quite a bit, because obviously being female, my experience of martial arts in the sort of 70s, 80s is informed by sort of things that I saw on TV, which may be quite different to, I think, most of the people that I've started to speak to.
Mm,
Their influences were from the sort of 80s and 90s. Mine was a little bit earlier.
mm,
So because I remember really looking at Wonder Woman and going, wow,
mm,
she's, it's a comic. I loved comic at the time, but it was like, Linda Carter. I was too young to realize it was over sexualized female representation. But I thought, wow, she's really powerful. It's really great. I wish I could be like her in terms of
mm,
the sort of empowerment message that was coming through.
mm,
So I think, yeah, that potentially my research could look at female martial arts and things like that, because I feel it's been a bit of a struggle for me to learn martial arts. It's sometimes appeared to be quite a closed off thing.
mm,
It's really not for girls, a bit like the Yorkie chocolate bar. It's really not for girls, and it's only in recent years that it's become more accessible. So you don't really find a lot of females sort of in their sort of 50s and 60s who have gone through the martial arts route. So I think some sort of, and there were no representation for females
yeah.
martial artists
Yeah.
in adverts that I could foresee. It was all males actually, apart from sort of 19 sort of 60s early representation, which the BMK girl, yeah, she was quite a female empowered character,
Yeah.
but the form of representation is also quite appealing to males as well. It's quite sexualized in a way.
Yeah.
Because I've since had strangers approaching me who have come across the article,
Okay.
and it's brought back all these memories for them, and they've
I think
got a lot more out of the adverts.
there's something about uh, women, possibly Asian women, and they publish stuff or they appear in the media and they immediately get loads of attention. I mean, I was in a documentary film called I Am Bruce Lee, and my friend Terry Tom, who is an Asian woman, She was also in it, and I spoke to her a few months after that came out, and she said she deeply regretted being in the film because just a constant stream of emails and tweets and
Oh
people just
gosh.
wanting to. And I was like, yeah, I've had one person contact
All
me and
right.
asked me. Guess what he asked me? Who would have won in a fight, Bruce
All
Lee or
right.
Muhammad Ali? And it's like, oh man.
Oh
So I
no.
think that, and also I was looking at the articles, that your article and my article yesterday, and the stats for downloads and access of your article are much higher than mine, even though they've got very similar
Sorry.
titles, right? Very similar titles.
Yeah.
And I think there's a whole dynamic there in terms of names, gender, ethnicity, and people
Yeah.
feeling that they can contact you or that they should contact you.
No, I
And
do. I think that warrants a paper in itself.
it
It
does,
does.
it does. And
I want
I've
further
heard this
research about
from, I've,
female researching
yeah,
martial arts. You're going to get
well, it's not just
hassled.
martial arts. I've heard it from female bloggers and
Oh,
vloggers,
this is really
and men just
interesting.
go, okay, I have a right to contact you, and
Oh,
we're in a relationship, we're having a conversation. That's something that we,
oh,
the kind of gender and racial dynamics of who's going to contact you after you
yeah.
publish something or go public with something.
Hmm.
There's stacks to be said about that, isn't there? We've veered away from martial arts though.
Oh, sorry, martial arts. Sorry,
It's my
martial
fault.
arts. Yeah, I love martial arts. Yeah, it's best thing ever. It's the best. I wish I did martial arts studies when I was young. I think if you had such a thing, Paul, I would have been your first student enrolled there on the
Well,
course. Whether it's online or whatever, I'll be there.
yeah.
Attending
Well,
classes, listening.
well, Sally, it has been an absolute delight to speak to you again, and I hope that we catch up in the real world sometime soon. But thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you. That's great. Enjoyed it.